in this time period of feudalism, it's sometimes called feudal society. There are three groups of people. So feudal society is typically divided into three groups. In Latin, the bellatores, the oratores, and the laboratores. Dr. Dancer, we don't know Latin. Those who fight, those who pray, and those who work. These are the three groups of people who live in society. You fit into one of these, whoever you are. So the first group, those who fight. That's what we just talked about. They're the lords and the vassals. They are defined by their warrior status. They fight. That's what they do. They're not going to work. They're not going to farm the fields. That's not their thing. Their job is to be the professional warrior class. And they're probably actually not doing too much praying either because they're so much into fighting. All right, so that's the first order of society, the fighters. The second order is the orators, those who pray. And those who pray would be men of the church, bishops, priests, monks, and nuns. In the background behind me, you will see the monastery of Kells. Kells and Iona are some of the really famous monasteries during this period. They're attacked and brutally sacked by the Vikings. And this tells us something important, that the second order of society, the churchmen, those who pray, are very weak in this time period. They're not fighters. They're at the mercy of everybody else. Often the church in this period is trying to get control over noble warrior violence. This is actually an important theme in future units. How does the church try to get control over the violence of the nobles? Come back to that. So one of the really important forms of religious life, of course, is monasticism. Communities of religious men living together. Monasteries are important religious centers. They're also, again, centers of learning. Almost the only places keeping learning alive during this time period. The job of the monks is to pray for society, to pray that the craziness in society will be ended, to pray against the devil, and to serve as centers of learning, by which some people have said they saved civilization. And so these monks build incredible monasteries. Sometimes all we have is the remains because they were often destroyed in fighting, but they're amazing accomplishments during this time period. This takes us to the third group of people, the group almost no one cares about. The peasants, the laboratores, Latin word labor, those who worked. The peasants especially suffer from Viking attacks. They especially suffer from noble violence. This isn't surprising. They don't have weapons. They're not fighters. They can't defend themselves. And it's not like the king can protect them. By the time the king's army gets here, the Vikings are gone. So the peasants really suffer badly. This means they're forced to turn to the local noble, the local vassal, or the local lord for protection. And that's not good for them, because that protection isn't free. It comes with a price. So as the peasants turn to the Lord for protection, what do they give him in exchange? Well, they give him their work. They're not warriors. So they don't have money. So in exchange for protection, they agree to work on the Lord's fields. They work for him. And over time, they lose their freedom. They pass into an unfree status and become serfs. Now, a serf is not really the same as a slave. That might come to mind. It's not quite the same thing, because on one hand, serfs are not paid. They give the Lord a share of their crops, but at the same time, they're not property. They can't be bought and sold. They have rights. In a sense, they're bound to their land. They're not supposed to leave their land, but at the same time, this gives them the protection of, it's not like they can be sold from their land or have that land taken away from them. So serfs are not really free. They are tied to the land that they work on, they owe crops as a sort of tax to their lord. And during this time period, Europe is sliding into chaos. There's not much learning going on. What learning there is going on in the monasteries, but the monks are not having a great time of it either because they're caught in the middle of all this violence. The peasants themselves are caught in the middle of all this violence. And meanwhile, the nobles, who in theory are protecting people from the Vikings, are spending so much time fighting amongst each other that they can almost be as bad as the Vikings. And so this is what's known as feudal society. This is Europe in the 900s, in the thousands. This is the 200 years after Charlemagne. And it's really only when you start getting to the year 1000, 1050, that things start to calm down, that Europe finally starts to recover and things start to pick up again. This will be the subject of our next unit, the medieval recovery. But for now, we finish up with feudal society, where everything seems to be falling apart.